I'm Mark Crispin Miller. This is the first Tuesday event for December. We do this every month. Our basic aim is to give a forum to authors whose books deserve a wider public hearing, or whose books have been unfairly attacked, which is not the case tonight, I'm pleased to say. I'm very happy to have Barbie Zelizer speak tonight about her new book, About to Die. It is a fascinating and meticulous analysis of one of the most macabre aspects of modern media culture, which is the photograph of people about to die, presumably or in fact. She uses this particular genre of photograph as a way to open up news photography in general in a way that's far too subtle and various for me to do it justice in an introduction. She'll talk about this. So please join me in welcoming Barbie Zelizer.
I'm very pleased to be here tonight, and I'm thankful to Mark, I'm thankful to the bookstore for bringing me here to talk about this new book. And I want to talk about two fundamental questions. One is, why is it that we look at pictures about to die, and what does it mean when we do? And more important, what is it that the media are doing when they devote so much of their space and time to showing us pictures of people about to die? And I tackled these two questions in writing this book because the events involving death in the news are extraordinarily widespread. They stretch across natural disaster, across war, acts of terror, technological accidents, crime, assassinations. And the interesting thing is that in each of these very disparate events, what we see is a reduction of extraordinarily complicated and different events to one visual trope or one visual formula, that of people facing their own death. And that struck me as very peculiar. And I began to think, why was that happening, and what did it do to our understanding of the events themselves? What did it do to our understanding of death writ broadly across so many different kinds of public events of an unsettled, complicated, and difficult nature? So this this project has been with me ever since I started researching as a cultural historian. And every book I wrote, it seemed to be at the underside of what it was I was doing. When I did a book long ago on the Kennedy Assassination, the coverage of John F. Kennedy's assassination, I realized that one of the iconic photographs wasn't necessarily of Kennedy dying, because of course Kennedy dying at the time was missed by the US media, but it was of Lee Harvey Oswald being shot to death by Jack Ruby. And so you see that in the lower left-hand corner. That photo actually became an icon. It became a prize-winning Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph that in the years hence, we've come to remember the assassination of John F. Kennedy through its particular dissemination. At the top, another happy event, looking at the Holocaust. This had a particular macabre demeanor to it, by which Nazi perpetrators actually took pictures of people that they were about to kill in Nazi war-torn Europe during World War II. And what you're looking at here is a group of people herded up against a wall as they were about to be deported from the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943. And of course, closer to home, both in time and space, 9/11, an event which became particularly focused on the pictures of the Twin Towers, signifying people about to die, even if they didn't show the bodies per se. So this trope, I found, was emerging in a vast variety of events, all of which forced us as viewers, as the public, to focus on the unfolding of events through human anguish of people about to die. Now I want to just talk a little bit about why this made sense across the trajectory of news images. One is news images themselves are very contradictory in the journalistic record. Journalism tends to devote itself first and foremost to the words of news. News images are seen as somewhat of second-class citizens, by which the words tell us what we need to know. The images act as secondary fluff, if you will, or secondary additions, showing us aspects, not always the most important aspects of what it is we're reading in words. And this has developed a rather uneven use of news images, whereby we've all been in situations where we've looked at a news story, read a news story, listened to a news story, and then looked at the picture at its side and said, what is that doing here? It has nothing to do with what we're actually reading. So the actual use of images draws in a rather uneven fashion from the ambivalence that news organizations feel about the use and incorporation of images as part of the journalistic record. What these images do, however, is not only confined to images of people facing death. And one might argue that a great majority of images actually freeze a sequence of action at a particularly memorable moment, hold it long enough for the viewers and those making and looking at the news to think about what it is they're seeing long enough for them to actually, for the event that they are depicting to take on meaning. And we can think that this happens across the board. When the Flying Dutchwoman crossed the finish line in the 1948 Olympics, she was about to cross the finish line in the photograph that went around the world. When Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton began their affair, the picture of them, their first public outing together, conjured up everybody's imagination about what went on when the camera was turned off. And an East German soldier about to jump to freedom in the early 1980s from behind the Iron Curtain was pictured in a rather iconic stance and replayed many years hence. So that what we have here is a frozen sequence of action that plays to the viewer's imagination, it plays to the viewer's emotions, it plays to the contingency of the image by which we need to complete that which is not shown. We need to give meaning to aspects of events that we are not seeing. And this becomes even more the case when we think about images of death. Images of death use the same frozen sequence of action. They also use imagination, contingency, and the emotions to give meaning to what is shown. But unlike those other images, death, the picturing of death, constitutes a particular quandary for journalists. News organizations don't like to be particularly graphic about the death involved that comes to the forefront of many public events of an unsettled, complicated, and difficult nature. And so the about to die image, the image of somebody about to die rather than the more graphic image of that same person already dead, offers a useful tool for news organizations wanting to show depiction of events that are difficult to show. So whether we see people running from the tsunami in 2004, people falling out of a burning building in the early 1970s, a picture which won a Pulitzer Prize, or a small child in Colombia about to suffocate from a mudslide, what we are seeing is that frozen sequence of action that takes us into the event through a focus on human anguish. This is what I call the as-if of news images, and I distinguish that from what is normally called the as-is of the journalistic record. Journalism likes to think, journalists like to promote a version of the world as it is unfolding in the real world. These photos, however, don't show us necessarily what's unfolding on the ground, but they engage our imagination, our emotions, and contingency to focus on the contingent, the possible, the liminal, the uncertain, the hypothetical, the conditional, and the playful. And I'd like to just read a teensy bit from my book to show you, to suggest to you why this matters. Journalism often embraces images. Pardon me? Oh, I'm sorry, 23. That's great. But I should probably tell you that I'm reordering it a little bit. So I'm going 1, 3, 2. Journalism often embraces images that do not follow obvious lines of reasoned information relay, pushing the memorable shot over the topical one, the image that appears in every newspaper, newscast, and online news site, the picture that resembles a painting more than a real street scene, the shot that recalls familiar images from earlier events, similar or disparate. Though there may be some general belief that seeing is believing, seeing is preferred only under certain circumstances. Instead, as if prevails over as is, complicating the long-standing recognition of news images as carriers of reason and suggesting instead that images play to different impulses altogether. The power of the as-if can be used to simplify, soften, and render contingent the untenable features of the geopolitical realities that it depicts. Its invitation to respond as much to the imagined, the conditional, and the impossible as to the real and known may constitute a different kind of response to the unsettled events of the public sphere that deserves our attention. So that what we have here is an altogether different voice in the news. And what I'm suggesting in this book is what it does is it creates more similarities across fundamentally different events than they in fact warrant. And this, I think, is something worthy of our attention. The About to Die image draws from 5 different kinds of practices: compositional, textual, presentational, viewing, and mnemonic. And if I can find my piece of paper here, I'll talk about each of them in turn. Compositionally, they're simple, they're formulaic, they're uncluttered. What you see always in the middle of the image is the depiction or the suggestion of people about to die without any other visual material that would cause us to think about something else. The focus is on human anguish. These images play to the category over the detail, to the generalizable over the particular, to the familiar over the unfamiliar. Textually, these images use a whole lot of texts, headlines, titles, credits, captions, but those texts and the plethora of words that they bring us rarely tell us everything that we need to know. Instead, what we get is varying degrees of information about the fact of death, about the circumstance of death, about the cause of death, about the impact of death. So though sometimes these images have lots of text that come alongside them, they don't necessarily give us information that tells us what it is we're looking at. Presentationally, these images are presented in distinct ways, very distinct ways from normal news images. They're presented many times over in one newspaper, newscast, or online news site. They're presented in much the same way across news organizations, and they're presented at more than one time in the same news organization. Let me just read a little bit about this particular photo. This photo is a shot taken in 2000 at the beginning of the Intifada in the Middle East. And it depicts a 12-year-old Palestinian boy shortly before he was shot to death in a barrage of crossfire from Israeli soldiers and, in some versions, Palestinian citizens. The shot was actually taken by France 2 television first, and what you're looking at here is a photograph that was frame grabbed from that sequence. The shot is engulfed by the helplessness of its 2 depicted figures. Sorry, the page is 197. Both father and son exude sheer terror as they crouch futilely alongside a hard concrete block that serves as the backdrop for their inability to escape. The protective gestures of the father as he attempts to shield his son are framed by the 2 faces in full frontal view, pulled with the conflicting emotions of incomprehension, fear, and dread. The image refracts the complexity of a political conflict through the body of an individual about to die and provides a memorable and heart-rending loading of a complicated foreign battle onto the terrified face and body of a young child and his father. The photo's display was incessant and repeated, appearing across the front sections of nearly every major U.S. newspaper. Some papers printed the image more than once, and when they did so, it was on the front page. Newscasts showed both the film and still shots, and every news organization with online capabilities posted the pictures there too. Most displayed the photo of the child about to die in their most visible spaces: front pages, tops of broadcast lineups, galleries in online newscasts. And the sequence of him dying, if it appeared at all, appeared on inside pages or later in broadcasts. In each case of the photo's disappearance, its accompanying words noted clearly and explicitly the fact of Mohammed al-Dura's death. The photo continued to appear in the weeks and months that followed, with the boy suspended at the brink of death, even though he was already dead, reliving time and again his last moments in heart-stopping visibility. Viewing practices of these photos are also quite distinctive. Their reliance is on affect, on emotion, on the imagination. The photos spark a whole plethora of emotions, and the same photo, interestingly enough, seems to spark oppositional sides. So you can get indignation and complicity. You can get shame and indifference, all from the same photo. They are discussed widely, not only by people in the public, but by journalists, media critics, and other mediated forums. And they are often discussed in ways that deny what is being seen. One of the most patterned responses to these photos is, I did not believe that he was actually going to die. And here too we see the same. One Chicago Tribune reader observed, this is on page 199, observed that the images made me wish I could shout stop so loud it would be heard halfway around the world. Looking at these photos, I wanted God himself to put out his hand and stop the bullets, but he didn't. Even James Fallows, who later wrote a scathing review on the veracity of the original France 2 tape for the Atlantic Monthly, wanted to disbelieve. The footage and the photographs of the shooting are unforgettable, illustrating the way in which the news media transform reality. I have seen them replayed at least 100 times now, and on each repetition, I can't help hoping that this time the boy will get himself down low enough. This time, the shots will miss. And finally, these images always have some mnemonic or memory-driven aspect to them. They become fodder for memory. They become icons. They win journalistic prizes. They are recycled into toys, posters, T-shirts, toys, advertisements, and postage stamps, as we see here. All of this piggybacks on the as-is, but of course plays to the as-if. There are three kinds of photos that appear across the landscape of images of impending death, and I call them presumed death, possible death, and certain death, and I want to just take a little bit of time to discuss each of these in turn. Presumed death. Let's see. This would be on page 77. Images of presumed death tend to emerge in news coverage about large-scale tragedies when a large and often indeterminate number of people perish quickly. The individuals facing death in these tragedies cannot be easily or readily depicted, for the loss of human life tends to be extensive. Devastation can be natural, man-made, unanticipated, predictable, accidental, or intentional, caused by tornadoes, earthquakes, mudslides, volcanic eruptions, hurricanes, floods, fires, train wrecks, airplane crashes, war, and terror attacks. Though death tends to occur rapidly, its confirmation generally comes with a delay, allowing for presumption to stand as evidence of its occurrence within the evolving timetable of journalism. Often then, the people presumed about to die in these images may in fact be already dead, but using the camera to freeze a moment before their death can be confirmed suspends the image's temporality and facilitates our engagement with it through its as-if status. A second type of image is the image of possible death. And this is on page 123. And here we see, unlike the earlier images of presumed death that focus on physical or structural devastation, these images focus on human bodies that are anonymous and unnamed. Images of possible death focus on the human body, on people about to die. That this greater informational load does not undo their as-if status, for they remain suggestive, providing no texts confirming that the people depicted do indeed die. Images of possible death depict events whose scope, scale, and magnitude cannot be easily captured at the time of actual death. And this would be famine, illness, planned violence, mass extermination, epidemic, all circumstances in which death occurs to multiple individuals over a prolonged period of time. Individuals are shown in ways that suggest that they are about to die, even if they themselves do not in fact die, and the action anticipated beyond the camera's frame is assumed to cause the individual's death, even if it does not. So that here, what we see, these of course, I'll take just the photo at the bottom. These are pictures of victims of Pol Pot's Cambodia. Those particular pictures appeared after nearly 20 years, when they got a kind of rebirth, when the War and Truth Conciliation forums were trying to revisit the crimes that had been committed in the early 80s. At the top, the image of the Warsaw Ghetto Boy. This is a very famous picture from the Holocaust that did not appear at the time of the Holocaust's unfolding, but only years later. And it's significant because although the child himself remained anonymous, no one ever knew actually who he was. And years later, at least 5 separate individuals claimed that this particular picture depicted them as a child. And the uproar over those attempts, retrospective attempts at identification, was so great that Holocaust Remembrance Commission said it's better not to give these images particular identities. It's better to keep them symbolic, better to keep them anonymous, because they serve the purpose of Holocaust remembrance much better in that fashion. So this belies a particular aspect of these kinds of about-to-die photos, which is they are always retrospective and delayed. They don't appear in the first rush of journalistic documentation, but after some time. And for that reason, they're usually put forth not by journalists, but by fundraisers, by relief workers, aid workers, members of Truth and Reconciliation commissions, and politicians who want to use them to attract attention to deaths that appeared long before. And for that reason, at some level, it doesn't matter, as particularly here, that whether or not the people that we're looking at actually do die, because they stand in for a much larger group of people who we know did die. The third kind of image is the image of certain death. And these are the images where we know that the person is dead long before we see the image. This is the most elaborate textual, presentational, and set of viewing practices. These images, and here I'm on page 173, images of certain death provide the greatest degree of informational detail. Titles, captions, adjoining texts, the verbal information associated with sequenced pictures are all used to confirm that the person about to die is now dead. Whereas in other about-to-die images, the eventuality of death is left open, presumed, or inferred, here, the patterned, explicit, and elaborated textual leads establish death's inevitability rather than its likelihood. The more extensive informational load associated with these images might lead to our expectations that death is straightforward, might lead to less imagination, contingency, and emotions on the part of the journalists, news executives, politicians, officials, and viewers who see them. But that is not the case. Paradoxically, these images often draw more attention, debate, discussion, and ultimately a multiplicity of responses than other images of impending death. Words are used here in ways that paradoxically allow for the most active interpretive play around a depiction, shedding doubt on the fundamental relationship between words and images, and raising questions about what the image accomplishes in lieu of informational clarity. And you're looking here, of course, at the picture of Robert Capa in the Spanish Civil War. Again, Lee Harvey Oswald being shot to death by Jack Ruby. At the bottom, Saddam Hussein's hanging. At the top right, Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl before his beheading in Pakistan. And at the bottom, Neda Agha Sultan, who was shot to death in a student demonstration in Tehran in 2009. In each of these cases, what accompanied the display of these particular images was widespread debate over what the images actually showed. All of this is a long way of saying that just seeing is not only about understanding. And what I've been trying to argue in this book and trying to show you here is that these images, it doesn't really matter how much one understands of the events that these images depict. What is more important is that these images engage us regardless of where we go in understanding the events depicted. And just as a further way of showing this, I just want to very quickly highlight the ways in which presumed death, possible death, and certain death plays out in large-scale and well-known events of a complicated nature. Here we're looking at the Vietnam War, where 4 of the iconic photos depicted individuals about to die. The 3 on the left-hand side are pictures of certain death. We know the names of the individuals, at least in 2 of the 3 cases. We know in all of the three cases that the individuals depicted actually died, and we have visual documentation that shows us that alongside the images of their impending death. The interesting thing is that over the 8 years of the Vietnam War, what happens with the images is that they migrate back in the degree of informational detail they give us. So that the image that is most well known from the Vietnam War, which is what's commonly called the napalm girl, and was taken at the end of the war, was not an image of certain death, but was an image of possible death. The children in that particular photo, it was never made clear how many of them died and at what point in time, although the girl in the middle has since been given an identity showing that she did not die, though she did stand in for the larger group of children who did. Similarly, when we look at the depiction of AIDS over time, and again this is in the US press, what we see is that the early images of AIDS focused on images of certain death, defined, identified individuals, usually white, usually embraced by loving families, as we see here. This is one of the most iconic early images that was taken. And although it says 1990, it actually appeared a couple years earlier. If we look at more recent pictures of AIDS, what we see is that it has also gravitated back in degree of informational detail. What we get now are pictures of others, and typically these are black faces in Africa, unnamed and anonymous. Okay, so that it, again, suggesting that as an event takes on meaning over time, it does not necessarily gravitate in the degree of more information. And then finally, 9/11. We know that in the beginning of the coverage of 9/11, we saw particular images, not of certain death, but certainly of possible death, of defined individuals jumping or falling to their death from the Twin Towers. Those images, however, disappeared strategically over time, appearing in almost none of the retrospective literature that appeared in that first few years after the event. What we got instead, the signal image that reigned as supreme in visualizing the 9/11 attacks, was the Twin Towers themselves on fire, smoldering, imploding, with no vision, no visualization of the bodies themselves inside. So in concluding, I'd like to read from the final paragraph of the book, and this is page 326. The territory of the as-if is an invitational one. It summons possibility, chance, experimentation, hypothesis, play, elaboration, involvement, supposal, denial, liminality, impossibility, and speculation. Though it cannot exist without the as-is, it crafts a landscape of far more internally contradictory impulses than has been assumed about the news media. The as-if allows journalists, news executives, officials, politicians, and viewers to engage with public events as much with their hearts and guts as with their brains. Though its capacity to create a richer investment in the world remains still untold, investing in the as-if promises to make the as-is a bit more bearable. Given the volatility and uncertainty of much of today's world, that might not be such a bad thing. Thank you.
Okay.
And I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the difference between TV moving image versus still image, because the property you're talking about seems one that's sort of inherent in still photography. This has been this person, like what Bart talks about, you know, this person's about to die and is dead simultaneously. Yeah. But with TV news, like the Kennedy assassination of Oswald and stuff, people witnessed it via TV.
Right. It's a very good question. It's one that I wrestled with a lot going back and forth in the book. And I finally decided that what I needed to do was focus on the still image version of moving pictures. And I justify that because mnemonically, as a tool of memory, I think that the still image activates particular responses in ways that are not available in the moving image. So in thinking about not only how we respond to events through a still image versus a longer sequence, but also the ways in which still images are inherently transportable across news media, it seemed to me that I could make the argument in greater detail and with greater focus by looking at the still image and while saying at the same time that many of the attributes here exist in less detail or less intensity, I would say, with the graphic image.
Taking off from that question, I wonder if you could address the difference between print news and TV news vis-a-vis your opening claim that the image is a sort of second-class citizen in journalism, because it would seem that, you know, because TV news is so footage-based, that there would be a difference between those two types of journalism.
Again, I would say that it is a question of intensity. It's not a question. I don't think that the relationship does not invert on itself. It does not change, although clearly television is more visually driven than the newspaper. But still, and I think that this is the important thing, is that even if in television we are hearing the words, it is the words that we attend to first in order to understand the image. And my argument has been that the image doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with those words, whether we're reading them or we're hearing them on any of the broadcast media.
Yeah.
If you could also address how it's different on legacy sites and print, because Times on the web is much more visual in a lot of ways, very heavy on slideshows for reasons because they're much more popular than video because people are at work, and how that's different from print. And also the role of editing images, because I see there's a little bit of that in the book, when someone has decided what will become the iconic image.
Okay, there were two questions actually. One was the question of what happens with, say, legacy media versus mainstream, in the sense that legacy media, such as Times Inc., typically pushes for more visuals over words, correct?
Oh, I meant nytimes.com, that how the website has many more images.
Yes. Okay. In other words, it's another version, I think, of this tension between the words as supreme versus the images kind of pushing them a little bit to the side. And the second question was, what about the role of editing? Again, what I would say is it's a question of degree. I focus on words primarily because that still remains the record. Okay, we don't have a journalistic record that is driven by images alone. We have a journalistic record that is driven first by words, sometimes with images close by, sometimes with images not at all. And I think that when one is looking at the ways in which images have been incorporated over time, we're certainly in a better place today than we used to be. But I'm looking at 3 centuries of images here, or 2.25 centuries of images, and I'm trying to figure out why it is that despite images being used progressively more and more frequently and more prominently over 150 years, why it is that they still haven't found their own voice. And I would argue that even in the more visually oriented formats, they are still subservient to words. That's the first question. The second question has to do with editing. I think that editing is probably one of the dirty little secrets of journalism. And by that I mean that editing, particularly picture editing, is done not by the photographers. It's not done by the people who are actually taking the pictures. And in many of the close analyses of images that I provide in this book, I spoke with the photographers who had actually taken the pictures, and they said that once the image is sent back to the home board, it's gone. They often don't even know which of their images are going to turn up on the website or in the newscast or in the newspaper. So that what you have is people editing visually who may not have a very good visual literacy, who may not understand the relationship between the various images and what was happening on the ground, but what they do have is they have the verbal record. They have the words that tells them what the story is. And this is part of the problem that has occurred with these images. One of the stories that I tell in this book is about the Taliban. During a 2-week period in November of 2002, when the Northern Alliance forces, in association with when they went into Afghanistan, and a number of Taliban fighters were slaughtered brutally across the northern territories. When those images, which were quite detailed in delineating the gruesomeness of these atrocious deaths, when those images came back to the US media for dissemination after they had been edited by the in-house editors, the images that appeared were pictures of people about to die. There were pictures of lone turbaned men looking up in fear at a larger group of individuals who were about to beat them to death. And the interesting thing was even the texts that were appended to those images told us far from what we needed to know. What we got in all across the the U.S. press, U.S. news media, was captions that said that these fellows had been roughed up, beaten, taken away. Their fate was unknown. In media in other countries, and I use a small contrast between the elitist media in the United States and the tabloids in Britain, what happened to those men was detailed not only in words but in images as well. So here you have a gross error being committed on the backs of editing, on the backs of verbal texts that actually generated a wide misunderstanding of that particular series of events. And that, of course, that's only one of a number of events that went through that kind of treatment.
Hi, you showed us images of certain death migrating over time to more dominant images of presumed death. I thought the 9/11 example was really clear. I'm wondering, do you think that's some sort of a reflection of an editorial practice where they decide that it's the better part of decorum to go that route, or what's at work there, do you think?
The question was, if you didn't hear it, is what happens when there's a gravitation back in detail, when it moves from a more explicit information to, say, the images of presumed death? Is that an editorial policy upholding decorum. I wish it were that simple. I think that every country has its blind spots. Every country's media, both explicitly and implicitly, draws parameters about what is appropriate to show. So, you know, the pictures of Princess Diana about to die in the back of her car were widely banned in Britain and shown all over Italy and the United States. The pictures of the dead after the 2004 tsunami were showed widely all across the United States and were protested in Thailand and Indonesia and Sri Lanka. So, you know, there's always a question of what works within a particular context and for whom. There is no question, however, that in all of these news media, across news organizations, regardless of where we are, death is difficult to depict. It is difficult. It is a quandary for journalists because, of course, all of the events that I'm dealing with in this book are the events of the front page, the wars and the terrorism and the natural disasters and the epidemics and the famines. They are events about death. And if showing death is difficult, then how are news organizations supposed to use images in a similar degree to a degree that they use words? And my argument has long been that we should be using the same parameters. If we can tell a story, we should be able to show a story. This particular trope is a way of relieving news organizations of what I feel is their responsibility to show.
I had a question about the certain death pictures. The ones that you showed, they were more explicit, where you actually see the person and the body, and it's clear what's going to happen. What about a certain death image where you just see the body covered up? Like there was recently this, I guess yesterday, this accident in Italy where there were 8 cyclists who were hit by a car, and they had the photos all over the place, but they were just covered with the white sheets, and you see that sometimes with traffic accidents in local papers. I wondered if you had a different take on that.
Yeah, the question is, what about pictures of death? Those aren't pictures of about to die images. Those are pictures of death themselves. And I'm grateful for the question because I think it's important to note that I'm not making the argument that death doesn't appear at all in pictures. Of course it appears. But my argument would be is that when one looks at a picture of a dead corpse, there's a kind of objectifying distance. There's not much you can do as a viewer. As opposed to that, when one looks at somebody who is looking terror-stricken as they are about to die, that pulls us in. That creates engagement. Subjectively, we want to help. We want to stop the action. So even if our response is illogical and irrational, it's still a response that is quite different from what we feel when we look at pictures of corpses.
My question is about curation, and you talked about how there's discrimination at the top down. And I wondered how, now we have the internet and viral media and people uploading and so on. I wondered how that's changed the scene.
We want it to change. It isn't changing at all. We're just getting more of the same. I mean, it's very interesting because I started working on this book in 2000. That was a long time ago in terms of internet years. And we weren't at the same place then that we are now. And beyond that, of course, I deal with events starting in the 1860s and all the way back to, Lincoln's assassination, the Great Chicago Fire. So, the involvement, the invocation of this particular visual formula has persisted regardless of what technologies we've had available. And I would argue that the same tension exists on the internet today. I was wondering, as I was working through the timeline that I had constructed for myself, whether or not as I got to events that were playing out simultaneously on the internet and in news organizations, was I going to see difference? And I don't. And so what it suggests is that it's not only about journalism, it's about how we have come to our willingness to see death as well as to show it more generally.
First of all, I would like to point out that some words have
Contingency and imagination.
On the right, on the left, but that's...
Oh.
So
well, that's because we went from PowerPoint to Keynote, and so my margins somehow didn't appear right.
I just wanted to point it out. But my question actually is there a relation between the the moment or the movement from as if photographs to as is photographs to as if photographs, and the disappearance of this really hard, more hardcore photograph, so to say, and the process of iconization. I mean, how would you consider the relation between the two processes?
I would say that many of these images are in fact iconic photographs, but these photographs are not only iconic photographs. In other words, this formula, this trope that I'm identifying, bears all the traits that make these photos great candidates for iconization. But they go beyond iconization. And so if you look, and if you're as neurotic as I am, I look at a newspaper and the first thing I see this trope all over the place. So it is both, there are both the high points of the trope, which I would call the icons, and there are the low points of the trope. Suggesting that the icons, the ones that we recognize as news icons, the ones that win the Pulitzer Prizes and the various awards, the ones that get the most recycling they're the upstairs. But that doesn't suggest that the downstairs isn't there as well.
Can I ask another one? Sure. If you could talk about ideology and dominant memories. So with the Twin Towers being attacked becoming the iconic image that fits well politically for what the U.S. is doing, and Palestinian stamp fits into all that type of stuff. I mean, there's a reductive nature going on here.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I mean, and that's what I was saying, that everybody has their parameters, and their parameters work with the given context. These images can't survive if they offset the context. They need the context to work, because it's not just about news organizations. It's about politicians. It's about viewers. It's about bookstores. It's about advertisements. I mean, the ways in which these images strike out and retain their authority depend or are discreetly reliant on a context that feeds those parameters as being set in place. So absolutely, that's part of it. But it's not all of it. I think that it's very easy to, I often get asked the question, it's just news organizations, they're just doing the government's bid. Not at all. I would say not at all that that's the case. That is part of the picture. But I think that there are processes at work within journalism that are far more discreet, far more suggestive, far more less explicit than just ideology and indoctrination. And I think that those are the processes that we really need to be thinking about. We need to be asking the question why it is that we don't demand that we see in images what we hear or read in words. That too is a level of complicity that doesn't really have to do with ideology per se.
And this will be the last question.
Yes.
Well, they have a saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So, how do you see the difference between words and pictures? So much more immediate this way, and sometimes often difficult to take in. And yet, oftentimes, we look for words to help us understand what we're seeing.
I think you've given me the answer yourself. I think that the question was, pictures are worth 1,000 words, and what is the difference between words and images? And I would say that in much the same way that words require, it's the old definition, words are linear, words are rational, words are singular. We apply a uniform narrative to explain the messiness that we find in images. But it is the messiness that engages us. And my argument has been that for as long as news pictures have been part of journalism, we have continued to push and to drive the linearity, the rationality, the reasoned information relay Images are far messier and suggest that something far more multiple is going on in our engagement with public events, and so I would argue that it is precisely those aspects of the image that are rising here to the level of a different voice in the news that has been there for quite some time.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Again, you can get your copy of About to Die and have it signed by this live author. So keep your eyes on the website for the bookstore to get announcements of our subsequent events. And thank you all very much for coming. And thank you, Barbie. That was really great.
Thank you for coming.